Dr. Chris Hentschel will be addressing today the webinar, and his topic is the new life sciences information innovation ecosystem. Basically, a word about Dr. Hentschel. Dr. Hentschel is a molecular biologist who has had pioneering and often transformative leadership roles in biosciences, whether in the public sector, the private sector, or in public-private partnerships. He has also been a non-executive board member of several philanthropic non-profit organizations associated with global public health. A biochemistry graduate from King's College London, Dr. Hentschel started his career as an academic researcher at the National Institute for Medical Research in London, where his studies gained him a series of research fellowships, first in London, then as a European Molecular Biology Fellow at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. Having been involved in the development of many successful products in the life sciences, he remains fascinated and excited by the power of innovation to transform and save lives. Dr. Hentschel, the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, Dr. Conrad, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for the university for inviting me to give this webinar. I think that last sentence of your introduction is a very good springboard for what I want to talk about, which is the power of innovation. And in this title, I use the words new because I want to talk a little bit about some elements which have developed in the ecosystem over the last few decades, let's say, but I want to paint a big picture, and in the Q&A, I'm happy to dive into more detail in anything that I might have touched on. But as I think everybody can imagine, it's a very big topic. It's a bigger topic than can be talked about in detail in 1 hour. So there is a certain level at which I will try to keep the conversation, and in the Q&A, I can go into more detail. Now, if you look at the first slide here, which is just the title slide, the first thing, let me turn on my pointer here. So maybe the first thing I want to draw your attention to, and can I ask the host, can you see the pointer? Does it work? I'm pointing out some things.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
Yes, it does. Okay. So at the bottom, I've got a URL. This URL is actually this presentation on Google Drive. Anybody after the seminar, if they want to look at it directly, it's shared publicly and you will be able to look at this. But of course, you will have the recording as well. And so you will have my voice as well from the recording later on. Around the edge are a number of organizations that I have been involved in during my career. Some of them are newer and some of them are older. I want to draw your attention towards the end of the talk to Cube Labs, which is certainly part of the new life sciences ecosystem in Europe. But as Dr. Cotran mentioned, I have spanned both private and public roles, and right at the other corner here, Medicines for Malaria Venture, that is an example of a public-private partnership in global public health. Each of these little logos here, they're all linked. They're all hyperlinked to the website. So anybody who has this presentation can look in at more detail. At the other corner, the Ulysses Advisory Group is a consultancy in healthcare. And again, that's all linked. At the other bottom corner, LifeArc this is actually a charity in England, in Britain, also to do with bringing life science products to the market, but done through a charity. So again, to keep it simple, I'm not going to dive directly into these, but anybody who wants to can click on those links and look in more detail. And I'll talk a little bit more about Cube Labs later on. So that's the broad perspective of the presentation. Let me go to the first slide now and talk a little bit about one of the building blocks of innovation, which of course is the creation of knowledge. There are many elements to the creation of knowledge. Right here, you can see universities. Clearly, universities are part of the ecosystem of knowledge creation. Universities very often do research, but there are many other elements in the knowledge creation ecosystem, both creators and sources, and they are mentioned around here, and you can see libraries, the academic, the peer-reviewed literature, for example, public research labs, technical colleges, private research labs. And then I mention here patent databases, because there is a difference between invention and innovation. Invention is really the idea, the creating the idea, but innovation requires subsequent actions, which often require a lot of other components, including intellectual property. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about that particular aspect. Now, you can see here that I've also got a little link to something called Google Patent. I'll explain why in a second. And also two other icons, which are DARPA and Cern. And the reason I mention these two, DARPA and Cern, these are public research bodies. One in Switzerland, Cern, and DARPA is in the US. It's actually funded by the Department of Defense. But these two were involved in the start of the internet. DARPA in particular was the first organization that tried to see whether you could get computers to talk to each other. And of course, we're talking to each other right now on computers, but the first time it ever happened was in DARPA, a US Department of Defense research organization. And the reason this is important is that the internet and digital media has completely transformed the world of knowledge. And I'm going to keep on repeating this theme and trying to illustrate how important this is today. Cern is in Switzerland, and it's actually, I'll click on this link, see, just to check whether the links work. Right, so this is the Cern website, and hopefully you can see that it's really a basic research organization to do with, the development of fundamental particles. That's really what it does. Are you able to see this on your screens? I'm just check.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so this is just a check that the whole system works. So Cern is a body that investigates fundamental particles of the universe. So why is it in this presentation about healthcare and the ecosystem? Because it's the first place in the world that discovered how to hyperlink sources of information so that you could search in an easy way for the information you looked at. So to go back to the presentation, it's really DARPA, it's gone, let me say, DARPA perhaps invented the internet in some way, but Cern made it a practical thing. And the scientist who did that, Tim Berners-Lee, you may know him. I mean, he is really the father of the World Wide Web, and that was done in Cern in Switzerland. So why did the internet change everything? I think the next slide talks about this. It talks about the creation of knowledge and how it's measured. So first of all, knowledge is data. So you can easily measure knowledge, and the unit of measuring knowledge nowadays is usually the petabyte, which is a very, very large number of bytes. For example, the Library of Congress in the US, the total holdings of the Library of Congress are 20 petabytes of data. But look at this graph here. It tells you about the change with time. In around 1900, knowledge was doubling at a speed of approximately once a century, based on those kind of petabyte metrics. By 1945, so towards the end of the Second World War, it was accelerating to about doubling once every 25 years. Well, I wasn't born there, but I was born in 1952. Yes, I'm quite old. I'll have to tell you, I was born there, and there was no internet there, but somewhere between when I was born and when I graduated, the internet was invented somewhere along here. And it really led to an exponential growth in knowledge. And right at the end here is a paper developed by IBM, which predicts now that knowledge will double every 11 to 12 hours. Now, you might think this is absolutely incredible. How is it possible for knowledge to be doubling at this rate? And it is incredible. And the reason they make this prediction is because historically knowledge was created by humans, researchers, but now with artificial intelligence, knowledge is also being created by chips and computers and so on. And you may not sort of really realize this, but I think if you ever spend time on the internet, you will know that you get followed by advertisements that are relevant to your interests, or at least are supposed to be relevant to your interests. And that's because there are little bits and computers who are looking at big data and are trying to figure out information about you. But that's just one example. According to this prediction by IBM, the Internet of Things, which is, you know, at an early phase in which almost every device, your refrigerator and so on, this will all be creating more knowledge that will itself create more knowledge. And this is how you get this prediction of knowledge doubling every 11 to 12 hours. By the way, these are links. Again, I can't really, because of time, I can't really go into them, but they go into more detail about this story and why it is now believed that knowledge is doubling at this incredible rate. Maybe I'll just click one of the links to show you. Well, this is really to tell you about the metric, which is really the petabyte, and to show that, you know, now information, well, how big is a petabyte? It's 11,000 4K movies, 20 petabytes in the data of the Library of Congress, and so on. And using these metrics, you can come up with these figures of how quickly information is accumulating, knowledge is accumulating. So that is the situation that we find ourselves in today. Now, there is one side effect of this growth of knowledge, and that is it has to be stored somewhere. And of course, it's stored in data farms around the world. So each of these pictures are pictures of huge infrastructure projects, basically with servers storing information that is being created at this incredibly fast rate. This information is stored, but of course there is one problem that people are beginning to realize more and more about it. It requires quite a lot of energy to store this information. Actually, each one of these data farms consumes about the same amount of energy as a mid-sized town. And so if you can imagine mid-sized towns growing exponentially, you can see that soon you get into basically into an energy problem, particularly with global warming. It's a problem which hasn't quite been figured out. Now, I want to now change a little bit from talking about the sources of knowledge to another important component of innovation, which is culture. I mean, it isn't necessarily the case that if you create knowledge, you do anything terribly useful with it. It requires another element, and this element is a culture of innovation. In human history, one can see many interesting examples of this cultural effect. So, for example, if you go back to the 15th and 16th century, the Italian Renaissance was a period of incredible innovation that followed the Dark Ages in Europe. And one has to say, why did it suddenly happen? Well, it happened because of cultural changes in Italy, which enabled this. But this is just one example. You can take the example of the British Industrial Revolution that didn't last as long. It was from about 1760 to about 1840. But what happened? Why was there suddenly this burst of innovation? Well, it was a mixture of things. First of all, really the invention of capitalism, which produced a kind of incentive to exploit innovation, which happened in the UK. But of course, it was also the ability to use energy in a way that had never been used before, because it's really when coal started being used to produce engines. So that's one example, but we can have many examples. The golden era of Islam between the 8th and 14th century was a period of very, very significant innovation within a particular cultural setting. So to get innovation, you need this correct mixture of the components of innovation and the right culture. Here are some more examples of the effect of culture, and these are all things that you can Google and look at if you're interested in, but they are cultural effects within certain societies that either incentivized or, to the contrary, disincentivized innovation. The so-called tall poppy syndrome was an example of societies that didn't really like the idea of individuals being very different from the generality of the people in the population. And they actually, if somebody was very different in any way, you know, could run faster or was smarter or whatever, they put pressure that that difference should not be developed. And that was sometimes called the tall poppy syndrome. In Scandinavian ancient cultures, there was something called Janteloven, or the law of Jante, which was a cultural thing, which was a bit like the tall poppy syndrome. But what it was a way of saying to people, look, you really must use your talents and time towards helping you know, your group of people around you that you shouldn't try to distinguish yourself in a way and run away from the crowd. And that that kind of cultural thing still is a bit present in Scandinavia. I mean, I spend quite a lot of my time in Norway, and I'm sometimes surprised at some of the things that I see in Norway, which relate to this old janteloven culture. Number 8, wire syndrome. This is a very strange example, actually, from New Zealand. And it's an example of what happens when a society or a culture is deprived of many things, but has one thing that they can innovate on. In this case, number 8 wire was barbed wire. I mean, as you know, Europeans the British went to New Zealand and they founded colonies there, but they were all rural colonies, basically agricultural for sheep. And the only thing that was, sent from Britain was barbed wire to keep the sheep in. So it turned out that these people with lots and lots of barbed wire, but nothing else, I'm slightly exaggerating, invented all kinds of things you could do with barbed wire that nobody else really thought of. Again, there are many examples if you Google that. The Estonian unicorns. This is an example, and actually the Estonian unicorns and the Soviet era failure to turn innovation into, these are somehow related because they are both examples of something that happened essentially as a result of communism in the communist era in the Soviet Union. Of course, Estonia was part of that. And the Estonian unicorns are an example of what happens when you release people from a dominant society and they suddenly want to sort of go out on their own culturally. This is a clickable link, and if you click it, see, you go to an Invest in Estonia website, and you can see a lot of things about that society, which actually emphasizes innovation as being part of the culture. This is the Prime Minister talking about how everybody should innovate, a personal unicorn for every Estonian by 2043. I should have mentioned that a unicorn is a company, a startup company that has developed to the point of generating $1 billion worth of sales. So it's a very, very successful startup. And she is saying there should be, whatever it is, 43 or a personal unicorn for every Estonian. By that, it's a very, very high target, but that's what they say they're going to do. And they have a number of unicorns already. Some of them you're very used to. Skype. These are all companies started in Estonia, all of which generated more than $1 billion worth of sales. Of course, we are not using Skype, but Zoom at the moment. And it shows you that you might be a pioneer because Skype really started this voice over IP revolution that we're part of right now. But are they going to be able to keep up? Are they competing well with Zoom? Well, you can judge. How often do you use Zoom? How often do you use Skype now? I use both of them, but I think Zoom has actually innovated a bit faster than Skype has. So this is another example. Now, essentially, I'm not going to, essentially, the Soviet era was a very interesting example of culture because there were a lot of very, very good scientists in the Soviet era, but they failed really to innovate. I mean, Russians invented or pioneered radio, solar panels, helicopters, caterpillar tractors, grain harvesters, and this is just a short list of inventions in Russia during the communist period, but they didn't actually succeed in turning them into the products that they eventually became. Almost all the innovators in the end moved. So Sikorsky, who invented helicopters, built the first prototypes in 1910. He was unable to develop a real business there, obviously, in the Soviet Union, and he eventually went to the US and founded Sikorsky helicopters in the US. The videotape recorder, a Russian-born Alexander Poniatov, he invented all the technology, but the actual products were developed in the US, exactly the same sort of reason. One was a culture that liked innovation, another was a culture that didn't really understand how to handle innovation well. And then there's, the radio. I think most people tend to think that the radio was invented by Marconi in Italy, but actually it wasn't. It was invented in the Soviet Union, but the Soviets didn't quite understand what to do with it, and rather bizarrely, they actually prevented Alexander Popov from patenting it. So really, they did almost everything wrong in terms of generating innovation from that eventual discovery. And oops, no, sorry. And then a very, very important thing was the discovery of transformers. Of course, transformers are in very, very many electronic goods today, and had that been really developed and then further exploited into the electronic goods industry, you would be buying a lot of things from Russia, but actually you're not buying very many things from Russia today. So that's part of, I hope you're convinced that culture is an important part of innovation. Now let me turn to another little element, which I think it's important to understand, and that is that innovation for private goods, the sort of things that you buy in shops or the internet, is a bit different from innovation for public goods. Public goods actually has a meaning in economics, and it is a kind of good that is generally distributed freely. It's a public good. I think if I click on this link, it probably will tell you in much more. Yes. You can see if you go to this link, a decent explanation of what public goods are. They are normally produced through funding by taxation, which is very different from private goods, because private goods are normally produced by funding from investors. So it's a completely different world. Now, the other source of funding for public goods are actually philanthropies. So philanthropic organizations very often produce public goods. This is very different from private goods, because these are produced by investors, or they're funded by investors. And for investors, it's very important to reduce the risk of innovation. And a very important component of reducing the risk that you will get any financial return, are patents and intellectual property rights. This link here goes to WIPO, which is the body that regulates intellectual property rights. The reason I've put it in is because there are many more intellectual property rights than just patents. Patents are well known in innovation, but there are many intellectual property rights. And if you're interested in that topic, that link will explain a lot more on the WIPO site what those other intellectual property rights are. You can see in the middle here, I've got something called common goods. these are goods that are distributed both through private sector channels and through public sector channels, and are usually co-funded between taxpayers and private companies. So, you know, for example, the AstraZeneca vaccine, that of course was produced by AstraZeneca, a private company, but it was only possible to produce it through funding from the UK government, for example, that enabled AstraZeneca to take the risk to develop this vaccine. So the bottom line, the conclusion of this is that, you know, there are different kinds of innovation, and they are actually treated in quite different ways, depending on whether you're trying to satisfy private goods or public goods. Now, let's go a little bit more into detail of the various components. Well, I already mentioned WIPO, which sits on the top of the intellectual property hierarchy, because it basically determines the rules of how this whole intellectual property system works. But there are many other components. There are patent attorneys, patent offices. In universities, there are technology transfer offices. These transfer offices usually try to put together packages of intellectual property discovered in the universities, and they want to usually license them to companies. We've already talked about public-private partnerships. MMV that I was involved in was one example. It was producing a public good, but it actually worked with companies to produce that public good. Venture capital is quite an old component of the innovation ecosystem. It's actually money or capital that is used at an early stage to enable innovation, but with a deal done so that the person who puts forward the money hopefully gets a return on the money. So it's a very kind of high risk kind of investment. It's definitely not the sort of thing that you find in your pension fund, because it's too high risk. But on the other hand, the returns of venture capital investors can be much, much higher than the sort of investment you might make in pension funds. Philanthropic foundations have become more and more important as sources for money and for funding of innovation. It's thought that the baby boomer generation, the high net worth individuals in the baby boomer generation, are sitting on something like $5 trillion worth of assets. Now, nobody can consume, I mean, we know these hyper rich people, nobody can consume this amount for themselves or even give them to their families. So very often they develop foundations like the Bill Gates Foundation, and these foundations very often fund innovation. There are many agencies, regulatory agencies, that are particularly important to the life sciences. And that's because life science products, healthcare products, in principle can be dangerous unless they have been carefully produced. And these regulatory agencies are the agencies that oversee whether something is done to the right standard, innovation is done to the right standard. And actually these regulatory agencies grew up to some extent because of mistakes that were made in the private sector. So for example, to take a famous mistake, the example of, is it tamoxifen, the drug that was used by pregnant women that gave rise to birth defects. this was done before the regulations that are now in place were put in place. So quite a lot of regulation was learned by mistakes, actually. But now there are at least 5 big global regulatory agencies, one in the USA, one in Europe, one in Japan, and so on. The WHO, World Health Organization, has its own pseudo-regulatory agency used for products used within their distribution channels, like UNICEF, for example. And then at the bottom of these innovation facilitators, I've put some of these new things that I want to talk a little bit more about in the rest of the talk. And these are essentially talent and know-how aggregators, because this innovation ecosystem is quite complicated, and very few people in universities understand it well. They may have a very bright idea, but they don't really know what to do from that bright idea. And these bodies, accelerators, venture builders, sandboxes, they are all organizations that have sprung up to actually help facilitate the problem between universities and products and services in the private sector. Here I mention Cube Labs. This is an organization that I'm now acting, I'm the chief scientific officer of, and it is actually a venture builder started in Italy that is doing exactly this. It is taking ideas from Italian universities. It is investing in them to create startup companies, but it is adding an extra layer onto what venture capitalists would do, because they would put in money, but they wouldn't put in know-how or management. And actually this know-how and management, it turns out, makes a lot of difference, as I hope I can show you. Well, this next slide, this is actually showing this venture builder model and how it's growing. It really started, you know, in the late 1990s or around 2000. But today there are, I think, globally, somewhere between 500 and 1,000 of these organizations around the world. This link here is actually a link to a white paper that goes into quite a lot of detail about the start and growth of these type of organizations. Now, this is another important paper, and I'm going to go a little bit more into detail to show how these organizations work, the venture studios. Actually, one thing you might have noticed is that sometimes they're called venture studios, and sometimes they're called venture builders, and sometimes they're actually called startup studios. So the nomenclature is a little confusing, but actually they're all basically the same thing. They're all organizations that aggregate capital, talent, and know-how and management to support university inventions into the flow of the commercial world. And here again, all these little icons, these are links to this. So this is a link actually to the paper Disrupting the Landscape. And it's I don't have time to go through it all, but it actually shows in great detail how this disruption occurred and why this model is really taking off globally. I'm going to summarize the findings of this paper for you. So go to the next slide, and here's a piece of data from this this paper that I just showed you, this report. It shows some rather important and some actually rather startling statistics. So startups, these are young companies, and these are startups that have traditionally been invested in by venture capitalists. The capitalists put in the money. And they managed in this survey to produce a return on investment of 21.3%. That is a fantastic return on investment, by the way. Anybody would be very, very happy. But the way that happens is typically they have some investments that produce an absolutely huge return and many failures. The companies started by venture builders or venture studios had an even higher return on investment. I mean, more than a doubling in this database that was looked at. So this is a pretty startling effect and explains to you why people are excited about this model. The other thing that's worth looking at is the effect on time. So if you start a company, usually you have to go through many different rounds of funding, and these take different amounts of time. And you don't want this to take too long, because in the world of investing into high-risk startups, there are very high rates at which the money that is invested today gets lost. It gets discounted very, very quickly. So in some cases, for example, there are discount rates of up to 30% of the money that's put in from the start. So you want this time to be as short as possible to go to the next funding round. And you can see here that this is in months that, let's take first of all from zero, that's when a company was founded, to a seed round. This is usually the first round of funding, usually to $1 or $2 million of money put in. Well, in companies started by studios, this was about 10.7 months. Companies started by venture capitalists, 36 months. And then the next round would be the Series A round. And in companies started by venture capitalists, 20 months, by venture studios, 14.5. So, oops. So let me come to some conclusions now, and then we can have some discussion. As far as the innovation ecosystem is concerned, there is a very dramatic change that has occurred in the last few decades, and that is that the knowledge base is increasing at an incredibly fast rate, and it's quite hard to know how to handle this, and even storing this information is quite hard. The second conclusion is that public and private innovation and the ways it happens are quite different, but they are both probably equally important. We all need public goods and we all need private goods. One of the biggest drivers of innovation has been essentially the digital ecospace that has developed since the invention of the internet, and particularly the fact that artificial intelligence is now creating knowledge itself. It's no longer humans which are creating knowledge, it's actually machines which are creating knowledge. And we are having to deal with this in a way that we never dealt with before. And so one way of dealing with this is, of course, that the ecosystem is evolving with new players and new kinds of organizations that have developed in this ecosystem. And one kind of organization I'm calling here component aggregators or managers, because venture builders or venture studios, these are basically component aggregators which aggregate capital, talent, know-how, business development, and so on into organizations that themselves facilitate the starting of companies, usually from universities. And these organizations are now disrupting the innovation space. I mentioned here that public-private partnerships, like MMV that I mentioned, these are also component aggregators. These also are essentially management organizations. So MMV sits in Geneva, in Switzerland, with talented people managing projects literally all around the world. I think there are 300 projects around the world that are being managed in Geneva, but the know-how and the money is distributed from the aggregator from Geneva. So finally, to talk a little bit about the venture studios themselves, the conclusions are these studios or builders, I'm calling them studios here, but as I said, I could call them venture builders. They deliver immense value to both the universities, but also to the investors in innovation, because they shorten the timelines and they decrease, they mitigate the risk of innovation. So they attract investors and talent around solving problems. Studios address these problems by building companies. So that is one of the first things they do. They see an idea and they create a company. They incorporate companies around the idea when the time is right. Oops. So, right, so as the proliferation of the model continues and more success stories and data points are published, there is a growing interest in these organizations by a number of big key stakeholders, like the big corporations, the big companies, the global entrepreneurs, investors, and so on. This is really a big trend that's happening right now. And as I said, at the moment, I would encourage you very much to look at this example of Cube Labs in Italy. Right, and you can see the key message here. We enable innovation from Cube Labs in Italy. Here are a list of companies that have already been created. Capital, it produces the capital for companies and so on. So with that, I hope, I haven't been looking at my watch, but I hope I have left enough time for some discussion.